What's going on, everybody? And welcome into the 120th episode of the CRZY podcast. Now, as always, I'm your host, Stephen Gates, and this is a show where we talk about creativity, leadership, design, and everything else that helps to empower creative people. Remember, you can listen to all the shows, get the show notes, and a lot more. Just head over to thecrazy1.com. It's the words the crazy and the number 1.com. Make sure you hit subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to get the latest episodes whenever those come out, which I know haven't been that often for the last 7 months, but hey, we're getting back in the groove, so why not give that button a chance again? And also remember that the Crazy One is also on YouTube. I've got videos on there around career coaching, tutorials, masterclasses, old keynotes, and a whole bunch more. And there again, just head over to thecrazy1.com/YouTube. Man, where do I even start with this episode? How about if I start by saying, and look, I know I've said it before, and I'll say it again, but I still believe that the biggest reason why more companies aren't more innovative is because of the way they hire people. It's a topic I've talked about before. We talked about it back in episode 107 when we talked about how to sort of outsmart a broken recruiting system. We talked about it in episode 98 whenever we talked about what to do when you get laid off. Now, those two episodes came crashing together and took on a whole new meaning for me recently whenever, what would it be? Probably about a month and a half ago, I got laid off for the third time in my career. It was an interesting moment because I found myself going back and listening to those episodes as I could use some insight. I could use some advice on how to handle what was going on. And it's whenever you've done this show for nearly 6 years, sometimes you put out good advice that you've forgotten about. And I think that being thrown back into this world, being thrown back into this process is maddening, emotional, and reminded me just how deeply broken the process of finding a new job really is. And I think that it also made me realize something. Look, I've known it for a really long time, but it made me remember it, and it's what I want to talk about today. And that's applying for your next job won't work. Because the reality is when you do some research and you start to really look at the numbers, you find out that it actually doesn't work to a shocking extent. So what I wanted to do is I felt like the combination of my current situation out here looking for a job. And so it also, shameless plug, if you're listening to the episode in real time and you or your company needs a design leader, feel free to reach out because I'm looking for a new job and looking for a new team. But I think that it felt like that combination of that moment, along with some research that I've been doing that really shows how broken this system is, was the perfect moment to maybe come back and do this show. So in this episode, I want to explore the numbers to show you why applying for a job doesn't work. I want to talk about what can change. I want to talk about what won't change. And I also want to talk about what you could do differently instead of engaging in this process, which is something that I've been trying and living and doing firsthand over the last couple weeks. But let's start by breaking this problem down by the numbers and really look at what's going on here. So I went out and actually pulled the latest 2022 job data and pulled this from a number of different sources. And look, I think the reality is if you've been through this process anytime recently, I don't think any of these numbers are going to surprise you. I have to admit that given some of my recent experience, maybe I even found them a little comforting to know that I'm not alone in my frustration. But I think it's also sobering just to see how bad it is. Let's start with the big number. Let's start with the one or the combination of a couple that I find so eye-opening. So whenever you look at it, about 90% of us engage in applying for a job when we're searching for a new position. Because look, what else are we supposed to do? That's the common way that we all do it. So over 90% of us, you're looking for a new position, you're on Glassdoor, you're on LinkedIn, you're on these different sites, you're doing that sort of thing. Now, the problem with the easy access to a lot of those job applications is that right now the average job is getting about 250 applications per job. So 90% of us are engaging it, ton of people are applying for jobs. Now, where this gets interesting and probably not surprising is that whenever you look at it, around 95% of all Fortune 500 companies use something that's called an application tracking system. What this is that a lot of times whenever you go in, unless they're using like the Easy Apply through LinkedIn, you have to go in and set up an account and bring in all your information and set it up in whatever the company's system is. Well, that's their version of an application tracking system. They do it to help them deal with that volume of that average of 250 applications per job. And what these things do is they help them sort through that volume and track those applications. Now, the reason why you need to understand that, and the reason why you need to understand how that's part of the problem, is these systems make things easier for the company. But you need to understand that just that system weeds out about 75% of all job applications. So this is not, your application is not being looked at by a human. In most cases, an algorithm is looking for keywords or it's doing particular things, and 3 out of 4 resumes are cut right there. So the interesting part as you go through that then is, let's flip it back to our side. So right now, on average, to get one offer, on average, you have to apply for somewhere between 41 and 80 jobs to get one offer. So that means that the job application process has a success rate of about 5%. Let's just take a moment to rewind that back and let's play that back again, shall we? 90% of the people are engaging in a process that works 5% of the time. 90% of the people, 5% of the time. I struggle, honestly, to think of another case like this where so many people are engaging in something that works at such an incredibly low percentage. Slot machines or the lottery would come to mind in terms of things that we're willing to engage in something that just has such an enormous failure rate. But if you keep digging into the data, I think there's more interesting things in there. So by contrast, if you look at it right now, 80% of jobs are filled through networking, meaning that somebody knew somebody, there was an introduction, somebody recommended somebody for a job. So 80% of the roles are filled through networking or recommendation, not through a cold job application. And applicants with an employee referral. So if you know somebody at the company, if somebody referred you, you'll get an interview 50% of the time. Now, those two numbers are going to be the foundation of what we talk about today, because I think those two numbers, they give us a playbook. They give us some hope. They give us a different direction into this process than what we found before. But as bad as that 90% of the people are engaging in something that works 5% of the time, I think it's also worth calling out that as I looked at that data, I could not find data that would break that down by either gender or racial orientation to understand how that played into those numbers. I'm guessing that as you looked at it by gender or by race, that did not improve the success rate, right? So I think this begs the question, why the hell are we all engaging in a system that is this broken? And how can we do something differently? Now, I can only start to answer that question from my own perspective and share what my experience has been over the last month and a half, which I will say aligns almost perfectly with these numbers. Now, look, I share that partially because I do also want to point out and want to make people aware that I really do believe that this process is the same for pretty much everybody. Unless you're some freak phenom unicorn, something like that, it doesn't matter your level of experience, it doesn't matter your brand, it doesn't matter what it is. I really believe these numbers hold across the board. So let's take a moment and dip into my experience over the last couple weeks. So the window we're talking about is probably bigger than 6 weeks. I've been out of a job for 6 weeks, but honestly, I saw the layoff coming, so before it happened, I wasn't able to tell anybody, so you do what you do. I went out and started applying for jobs. Now, since the market right now is pretty plentiful, I applied to, it was somewhere in the ballpark of about 50 jobs. So I had applications into about 50 different companies before I got laid off. Let's start with just that first window. So of those 50 applications, I heard back from 2 companies. So 50 applications, 2 responses. The sobering thing is 2 responses for 50 applications is twice the average response rate. So that's a little nutty. But since I've now actually been laid off, I would say probably realistically I've applied to about 30 or 40 more jobs, and I've heard back from none of those. So I would say that brings my average in line, that if we're looking at 2 responses for about 80 to 90 applications, we're seeing about that 90% engagement, 5% response rate. So that's in line. Now, I've got to be honest that as I'm sitting here, having to say these numbers out loud fills me with a lovely mix of rage, disgust, and a fair amount of feeling pretty inadequate having to say that out loud. But look, I think this process at best, whenever it works, when you find the new job, it can be life-changing, it can be amazing, it can be reaffirming. But I think for a lot of the moments outside of that, for me, this is one of the worst things you can go through in your career. Because over the last couple of weeks, it has at times made me not know what to do but to laugh at how inhumane people can be whenever they just ghost you, don't write you back. You're in the middle of a process. They tell you it's going great, and then you're out of the process the next day. There have been moments, again, if I'm being totally honest, where I have been so frustrated I've been brought to the edge of tears because it's just, why is it this difficult? And probably throughout have found several instances of being able to make up some pretty interesting new 4-letter words. Now, even though I know that the numbers and I know the failure rate, the reality was that, look, I was writing this show. I did the research, and I kept applying for jobs. And look, I think that this is a really common reaction. And I think the only way that I can interpret or normalize what this is because, especially if you've been laid off or fired, that comes with a pretty good dose of humility and anxiety. And I think for me and probably a lot of others, you are trying to find control and somehow self-soothe in this process. So even though you know it's not going to work, it feels like progress, so you self-soothe and you do it anyway. But that wasn't all I did. Because look, this is the 3rd time I've been laid off. So I decided that this time was time to also to do something different. Because I'd like to think that by the 3rd time, I've learned a couple things. And I think that one of the biggest things that I've come to understand is, and it really goes to what I was just talking about, that as you're going through this process, as you're looking for a new job, and I think this is especially important if you have been laid off or fired, that you really need to build what I would describe as a hope economy for yourself. Let me explain what that means. It means that you need to find some ways of creating and controlling hope as you move through this process. Because like I said, there is so much of it that makes you feel that is dehumanizing. There is so many times when you question your career, your decisions, your work. Like, why is it not enough? Why do they not want you? Why are they not interested in you, right? Like, it is something that I don't care who you are or what you do, you can't help but take it personally. And I think it's really common, and for a lot of people I've talked to, myself included, look, there are moments when you lose hope. You feel like there's nothing you can control, and I think that's really understandable. But for me, building that hope economy is looking at this and saying, look, how do I have a voice in this process? How do I have some control in this process? How do I reshape it so I'm just not blindly carpet bombing into a process that I know doesn't work, and to do something differently? And so I think this time I try to answer that question for myself. Because look, if I'm going to put a show out there, if I'm going to put some advice out there, I damn well better be able to have something to back it up to feel like it works. So this time, instead of just sort of quietly going into that job application process and applying to those endless openings, only to most of the time hear absolutely nothing back, I did something different. I decided, and I was able to do this because I got laid off. Now, obviously, we're going to have to alter this a little bit if you're still in your current job, but I got loud. I told everybody what happened. I owned the fact that I got laid off, and I owned the fact that I was looking for a job. Now, I think on the face of it, right, you would think that doing something like that would make a ton of sense. Don't have a job, need a job, tell people you need a job. But I think especially, and I've seen this, and I've talked to so many people over the last couple of weeks who have reached out, that especially when you're talking to people who've been laid off or been fired or things like that, there's a stigma, right? There's some shame. There's almost a scarlet letter that comes with that action. And that for a lot of people, they feel like it's a judgment on them. It's a judgment on, sort of what's happened. Now, what I would argue is, I think, look, if you get laid off, that is a business decision. Usually meaning that the business and the leadership did not make good decisions and that they had to then get rid of some people to get their bottom line back under control. Now, I also would say that even if you've been fired, sometimes that is a self-reflection of you. Sometimes that is a moment where you're going to have to look at yourself and think about how you need to make some different decisions and show up differently. But sometimes it's just a mismatch with the culture, with your boss, with a lot of different things that can happen. It isn't always that sort of gloom and doom that people think. So I wanted to do something different. So what I did was, what happened? I got the news on a Thursday. My last day was on a Friday. And that following Monday, I decided that I was going to tell the world what happened. I wanted to use my voice. I wanted to try and take some of that power back and wanted to see what happened. I'll be honest, I was not prepared for what happened next. Having somebody that's been in advertising before, still have a bit of an idea of how to run a campaign, create an eye-catching graphic, write something that's going to impact people. So I did. Went out and posted it on LinkedIn, Twitter, on my social media. And it was a post that within the first 72 hours garnered somewhere north of 350,000 views, a couple hundred comments, and so many messages that it took me nearly a week to be able to get back to everybody. That was not what I was expecting. That most of the time, you're sort of expecting condolences and, I'm so sorry, and those sort of things. But it resulted in over 50 interviews with different companies. Now, I think let's put an asterisk on that, right? Volume does not equal quality. So this is not 50 jobs where I was like, oh my God, I want every single one of those. There are definitely some good ones in there, having some interesting conversations, but I think that this is something, we'll talk about it in a minute. Your results are going to vary. But I think this is a great reminder and proof to all of us that I think more than anything, you never know how much support you have until you actually ask for it. And I think it's also something where it gives you the ability to be able to go about this differently, to use your network, to use your power, to use your voice, to demonstrate who you are. That was one of the most interesting byproducts that I honestly hadn't thought about one bit going into this. Was another number of companies said they reached out because I actually handled it this way. Because they said, look, we're looking for leaders who can handle change, who are good in adversity, who, aren't just going to be there whenever things are fine and easy. And by doing this the way that you did it, through your actions, you really showed that it was like, look, this happened. I'm going to own it. I'm going to figure it out, and I'm going to move forward. And that's the sort of leader that we really want. That was an angle I hadn't thought about, if I'm being honest. But like I said, your results are going to vary. I don't think for most people you're going to get that big of a reaction. But I do not think that invalidates the approach here. Because, look, I'm really happy to report, like I said, over the last couple weeks, I've been working with a lot of people who were about to take jobs they didn't want, who had been laid off for 5 or 6 months, who had lost hope, who they just weren't sure what to do and had reached out and said, look, can help me understand why you're doing this. And in several cases, people were about to take jobs they didn't want. They were about to just because they needed the money. They needed that. And I just said, look, can you give me a week? Can we try what we're about to talk about? And I'm happy to report every single one of those people got multiple job offers. Every single one of those people, by sort of following this approach, got to a place where they got a job that they really loved. So at least in the early data and statistics and testing this out, this approach works. And so we mentioned this before, that obviously this approach is mostly going to be if you don't have a job. But I do think that you can still be strategic in reaching out to people and reaching out to recruiters if you are employed and looking for something new. This idea of sort of reversing this process and kind of coming at it from a different angle, while the expression of it may be different, right? Like if you're unemployed or something like that, you go use the biggest megaphone you can get your hands on. But it doesn't mean that even if you are in a job right now and are looking, it doesn't mean that this action and this approach isn't going to work for you too. Now, the magnitude of the reaction I got is not something that happened overnight. And the funny part was, I think it really was the culmination of years and years and years of work that dated back to the first time I got laid off. Because the first time I got laid off, it was something I didn't see coming. And I was completely unprepared. My site, my resume, my network were in shambles. And it took me months to get the process up and going. It took me months to get everything pulled together to the point where I could honestly, seriously look for a job and contend for the sort of positions I wanted. Now, one of the deals that I made with myself was that the feeling that I had from that experience, how panicked I was, how lost I felt, how frustrated I was, that was a feeling I was never going to let go of. And I've used that to help me drive the building of my brand, my network, really preparing for another moment like that. Because the reality is, for all of us, we can believe we work for the greatest company in the world. We can believe our team is family. We can believe all of these sort of things that feel very comforting, where we feel very sheltered and very safe. I've talked about this before. I don't care who you are. There are going to be moments, because of the actions of leadership, because of the economy, because of forces outside of everyone's control, where things can change. The second time I got laid off with my work running globally in an Apple commercial after just having appeared in 8 Apple keynotes, bringing my company tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of press, one of the 2 big launch apps for the Apple Watch. None of that mattered. They still laid my ass off with the quickness. So I think it's something that you have to work on. But I would also say that getting to the place of having that support system of doing those things and being able to get that sort of reaction is something that anyone can do. Too often, though, I think imposter syndrome gets the best of us, and we go quiet. We don't know who we are. We don't know what we stand for. We are, again, ashamed or have problems with the fact that we need to move on from something, or we need to be able to find a new position. And so for me, it's been one of the most interesting journeys of my life and my career, because especially watching something where I started building my brand, I started building my network out of fear and selfishness, has grown into something more. Whenever I realized that I could help people, whenever I realized that I could have influence, whenever I realized that, again, you don't just have to do it for you, that, again, that a concept of karma and putting things out there, and that putting the work in, putting the energy out there in the hopes, and maybe even the fears, that one day, if something like this happened, that I might need to ask for some help, or to ask for some of the karma that I've been putting out there to come back. I think that's what was behind the magnitude of the response that I got. But that doesn't mean, again, that this isn't something that you can do yourself. So I don't want you to sort of hear that just because it was something I did, that it doesn't feel like, well, I got the response I did because of this show or something else like that. But here's the thing. If we want to get different results, we've got to use a different playbook. And that playbook has to be driven by the statistics that showed us how, again, the normal way of working doesn't really work. And we need to flip things around. And if you remember nothing from this show, I want you to remember this one single phrase. Because I think this phrase, whether you are a leader who is hiring people onto your team, or whether you are somebody who is looking for a new job, I think this is the key that is going to unlock it for you. I think that phrase is outreach is the new recruiting. And we're going to go into more detail about how do you do all that outreach in a minute, but the basics here are just a few things. I think one, is to actually connect with people, not with application processing systems, not with forms, not those sort of things, to actually connect with and build relationships with people. That's one of the most important things, because I think, one, if you want to build that hope economy, talking to people, having a conversation, even if it's that this isn't a good fit, there is a closure to that. There's a resolution to that. There's a progress in that. There is something that you will not find in applying for a job and hearing nothing back. I think it's using and building your network, meaning that we all have access to social media. We all have access to different things. We are all able to go out and to engage in a far broader community than the people who are just in front of us, and that's a tool that you can use in your favor. So use that. Share with social media. Talk about what it is you're looking for. Be specific about what you are looking for. If you want a remote role, a hybrid role, an in-person role, if you want a particular city, a particular industry, be specific. But I think the other part of this for me is that relationships start with conversations. And I think this point is especially important, because I think you have to recognize that as you're looking at jobs, one of the things that I've found is that so many things in this process are false flags. Too often, titles don't mean, honestly, much of anything. I've seen CEOs become senior directors at Google. I've seen art directors become SVPs at financial institutions, right? Like, the title that's on there, I think oftentimes we get too hung up on what that is. Like, for me, I focus on the responsibility and the comp. That'll tell you what's right or not. But I think you'll see that, and that often those job descriptions are then just these broad nets that cause insane amounts of imposter syndrome, but are often impossible to interpret because they're missing so many key ingredients. So you want to get around those things, right? You want to be able to talk to executives. You want to talk to hiring managers. You want to talk to recruiters. You want to hear what's really going on. You want to hear, what is this job really looking for? What's success going to be? Is it a good fit for me? Is that something that I want? Are the criteria I have going to align with what that is? But I want to build a relationship, because I think especially for so many creatives, our jobs don't always fit cleanly into boxes. So I think that ability to build that relationship, to have the conversation, to say, oh, you know what? That job maybe isn't right for you. But you know what? We have this other one coming up. We have something that's in the works. We have this other job over here with another hiring manager. We have something else. That's the moment that you want. Because that's the relationship, that's the connection, that's the warm introduction, that's the start of a real connection and building that hope economy. Because what these things let you do is they help you stand out. You go around the broken system and you greatly increase your chance of getting hired. Now, I think what we need to focus on and be clear on is what we are doing is trying to get into this process. That's the moment that we're trying to improve. And I do want to put an asterisk on, this is not going to change, unfortunately, your entire experience, because I think there's still a lot of things that you're going to see where this is not a magic bullet and you're still going to have problems. So there's still going to be a lot of problems and stress and frustration in the job search of, again, people who are ghosting you and applying, talking to people in the process, and suddenly they go with somebody else and they don't tell you why. And a lot of things that I think just sort of boil down to not many companies, I think, have learned what they should have from the Great Resignation. I don't bring this up to be discouraging, but I just want to normalize that, again, that those things are still going to happen. But what we want to be able to do is to increase your odds, to get better conversations, to reduce that failure rate, rejection rate, to be able to make sure that when you're putting that energy out there, you're getting a return on it on a much, much better rate. So this is going to be a bit of a rehash. We're going to throw some new things in here from what we talked about back in episode 107, which is how do we really start to short circuit this system? Now, what I'm going to say is, before you do your search, first and foremost and always, make sure that you are ready to go do a search. And I talk about this endlessly because there's just no escaping it. If you need to take the time to first and foremost know who you are, what you are good at, well, why are you different? These sort of basic things, because if you are not clear on that, I would argue you are going to struggle in your current role, but you're definitely going to struggle in your future role as well. But also, whenever I talk to people and they cannot express those, their resume, their site, their social media, their LinkedIn, and everything else follows right along that behind that, and not being able to talk about who they are. So even if they are getting the conversations, even if they are getting through that front door, in a lot of cases, they're not getting the interviews. They're not getting a very deep run into that process because they're sort of looking for the company or the hiring manager to tell them who they are or what they want. And that's not the way that normally works. For creatives, we want people who have their own opinion. So first and foremost, make sure you get that straight. But after that, put the work into your portfolio and your resume. Tell your story. This is what sets you apart. Again, I will continue to say that your portfolio and your resume are your first introduction. That in many cases, even if somebody says, hey, you should talk to so-and-so, they'll say, great, send me your resume and your portfolio. We'll take a look at it and get back to you. Warm introduction? Yes. Better odds? Yes. Guarantee of success? No. So I think you want to be able to put the work into that. Now, especially, I talk to a lot of people who will say, look, Steve, I just don't feel like the work that I have done is that great, or I'm really junior in my career, or I haven't had that much of an opportunity yet. Great. Your portfolio is your ability to show that you have not had the opportunity yet to be great. Your portfolio is your opportunity to have something that you can work on where you are the client. So make the most of it. Because if somebody goes in and they see a portfolio that looks like it's been half-assed with broken links, with links to things that don't work, with just screenshots with no explanation, where you're not telling your story, where you're not doing these sort of things, it's not going to be successful. This is an introduction. Make sure it makes the best one you possibly can. But I think the other part of it for me is, look, I think if you are going the laid off route and being able to post in your networks, if you have a job and you are trying to reach out to people, show some passion, show some depth, and ask for a conversation. Find the companies and teams that you're interested in and reach out to those team members, reach out to those leaders, reach out and do it with a sincere interest. Here again, I'll put a shameless plug in for the Amazing Design People list. There are over 7,000 mentors on that platform who are willing to give you free mentoring if you want it. I will probably almost guarantee you that whatever the company is you want to go work for, there is at least one, if not probably multiple mentors on that platform who can tell you what the process is like there, what they look for. They can look at your book, your resume, those sort of things, give you that feedback, right? Because I think it sets you apart from everybody else. It makes you more than a resume. And it lets you get better. Because again, like, great, let's go through my portfolio. Give me the feedback on what that is. Whenever you reach out and do those things, ask for feedback at the end to say, what did I do really well? What could I work on? Because all of this is going to do is it's going to build your network. Real relationships, not connections, right? That's the thing. LinkedIn connections don't mean anything. They aren't worth anything if there's not a real connection behind that. So again, I think that ability to work on building a real network, not a numerical paper, digital zeros and ones network, real people, that's what makes the difference. But I think you can, though, whenever you actually have those people, ask those people who you know to make connections, to make introductions. Again, you've seen there's a 50% chance you will get an interview whenever you have an introduction. So introduction is where you can create that conversation. Now, I'm not asking them to do all the work to shepherd that process. I'm also not asking strangers to make introductions. I get those on a weekly, if not daily basis of, I don't know how many people are in my network, but there's, again, probably somebody who works at some obscure company and somebody reaches out and says, oh, can you reach out to so-and-so? If I do not know you and I do not know the person I'm reaching out to, it is a meaningless connection. It's a meaningless introduction. So find out, do they really know these people? And again, is that somebody they can really talk to? If they do, use that. Another one, be more visible and vocal on your social media to draw people to you. This also doesn't just have to be a process of you chasing down them. Use your portfolio, your resume, platforms, work you've done, things like that to draw people to you. This is a more passive approach, but I believe in sort of, again, working any problem from multiple different angles. Put your thoughts out there, your experience out there. All of this is, there are things that I don't care what level of experience you are, who you are, where you live in the world, there are things you can share. There are things that you can do that people are going to be interested in. But I think as you're doing all of this, right, the more active engagement, the ability to be able to again, do this direct connect, build relationships. I think I'd be remiss, because this is something that I'm also working on, to not mention that you need to take care of your mental health and your attitude. And this is an area where I feel like I'm great at coaching other people on and a complete fraud whenever it comes to my own mental health. And look, I think that's just part of my journey. I don't think that there's anything more stressful or frustrating than searching for a new job, but I think you need to recognize it's going to take a toll. Take breaks, take mental health days, do something that's fun, go see friends, do these sort of things to be able to mix it up so you aren't just sitting and fixating on just this. But I think the other thing is you also have to recognize that you may not be successful. And I think that's even, right now what I'm in the middle of that process of is that, yeah, some of the things have been successful. Yeah, some companies have decided to go with other people. Yeah, a bunch of people haven't written me back. And I think for me, I take that as feedback. More of it is passive feedback than I would like. But for those people who have chosen to give me active feedback, it's a moment where I can reflect, refine, and evolve. Not just keep trying the same thing, not just doing the same thing over and over again. It's the opportunity for me to get better, to make my assets better, to make my thinking better, to get the feedback, question everything, and to keep working and refining, not just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And I think, again, I've talked to too many people who tell me they've applied to 50, 100, 200, 300, in one person's case, 500 jobs. They got the same result. And I asked them, what have you done differently? And they said nothing. So I think, again, just like any project, just treat it like a design problem. If you're not getting the results you need to pivot and keep working. But I think the big takeaways here for me is I think this ability for you to own your story, to own your voice, for good or bad, for the things that have gone really well, to celebrate the moments, the achievements, the awards, the great work. There may be moments where that needs to be balanced with you also celebrating the harder moments. Celebrating that you're not happy in your job. Celebrating that you got laid off. Celebrating that you got fired even. But I think that ability of just recognizing that's part of the process. And I think this is something for me, for all of us to think about, is how do we normalize this process more? How do we make this something that doesn't feel like that scarlet letter so much? Because that's really then based in the fact that those relationships matter. How you move through the world, how you move through your career and your reputation matter. I think that that's often, to me, I'm so reminded in these moments that I think there are really two moments that I think really define people for me. I generally care very little for how people act on good days. Good days are easy, right? It's easy to be happy. It's easy to be somebody's friend. It's easy to be there when everything's happy and easy. The two moments that I tend to really focus on are bad days, when there's a lot of stress. How do people act? Are they still kind? Are they still empathetic? Do they still think about other people? Or do they become mean, selfish, and just somebody sort of different? But the other moment that I find really interesting, and maybe this is a moment that you become more aware of when you become a leader, is I become very aware of the moment whenever you can no longer do something for people. I think that whenever you're leading a team, you become very aware of this moment when people quit your team. You really watch, and in that 2 week, they give notice and they're going to be 2 weeks to be gone. Do they stay there? Do they show up? Do they do their work? Do they really stay a part of the team? Do they, again, stay kind and empathetic and think about others and try to set up those who are still going to be there up for success? Or do they mail it in for that 2 weeks, not really care, make it obvious that, they're out of here and that this didn't mean that much to them anyway? Both of those say something. But I think also for me, I'm very much reminded, too, that it's an interesting example of that whenever you're a leader who is laid off or fired. It's interesting to watch in that moment whenever you can no longer do things for people. It's interesting to watch when suddenly you're not in charge of their career path or their promotion or their pay. Again, who are the people that are kind? Who are the ones that reach out? Who are the people that are there? And who are the ones that act differently? These are things that matter, right? I think these are the moments that the way you act in those moments define whenever you need help, will people be there? So it's something to think about. Now, like I said, I think this is something I'm seeing others have a ton of success with. We'll stay tuned, see where this adventure takes me, see where I land. Again, generated a ton of potential, a ton of attention, a lot of interesting conversations. we'll see where it lands. And like I said, maybe we'll come back into a revision to this episode, or maybe we'll come back into a confirmation of it. But like I said, from what I've seen so far, and from what I've seen in the past being on both sides of this process, this ability, and again, what the numbers show us, is that we need to think about this differently. So I hope this new approach will help you. I hope that the next time you find yourself in this position, you can reach for this. And even if you're not in this position, to start to prepare for it, to start to think about it, to start to know that the world can be a crazy place and these sort of things can happen to anybody. So why not start getting ready for it now so that you're in a stronger place whenever that stuff happens? And maybe even, you know what, maybe even doing that work can help you in your current job, because you know that you've got that support out there. You know you've got that impact out there. You know that maybe you're willing to take a few more risks even in your current job, because you know that you've got some options out there. None of those are bad things. So like I said before, you can find out more about this podcast. I'll have all the show notes and those sort of things. Just head over to thecrazy1.com. It's the words the crazy and the number 1.com. As always, ask people, especially now that the show is back up and running, do me a favor, leave a review. Let people know what you think about the show. I can see tons of people listening, not that many people leaving reviews. That's the only price of admission. Do me a favor, leave a review. You can always follow all my adventures, all my sort of more up-to-date raw feelings and things like that on social media. You can follow me personally on Instagram or Twitter, and follow the show on LinkedIn or Facebook. As always, these views are just my own. They don't represent any of my former employers. These are just my own personal thoughts. And lastly, I say it every time because I mean it every time, but thank you for your time. I know that time is the only real commodity any of us have. I'm always incredibly humbled you want to spend any of it listening to me. So let's go out there. Let's change this system. Let's do some things differently. Let's hope that there's a better job sitting out there waiting for me. And all the while, and as always, stay crazy.